The background to the column of text in this page is slightly translucent, allowing the page's background image to show through. To achieve this effect in the past, you would need to create the translucent column as part of the background image. But as you can see, if I resize the browser, that the background image is moving behind the column of text. So the two are not related, they're completely separate. There are two ways of achieving translucency in CSS3, using the opacity property and using one of the new color formats, RGBA or HSLA. RGBA stands for red, green, blue with alpha transparency, and HSLA stands for hue, saturation, lightness with alpha transparency. Using opacity and one of the new color formats is very similar, but they do have very different outcomes. Let's go into Dreamweaver and see the difference. I've got that same page here. If I put my cursor inside the text, you can see that it's in a div called content. So what I need to do is to go to the style sheet and make a change to the content style rule. I'm going to add opacity. The opacity property takes a value between 0 and 1. 0 is completely transparent and 1 is completely opaque. So for this demonstration, I'm going to go halfway between, say around 0.6. And if I go into live view, you can see that what has happened is that not only is the background to the text translucent, but the image has also been made translucent. And the reason for that is that opacity affects everything within the element to which it's applied. If we go back to the HTML code, there we are, the image is inside the content div. So because it's inside the content div, the opacity has also been applied to the image. Sometimes that might be the type of effect that you want, but very often it's not. So in that case, you need to use one of the new color formats with the background color. Let's just switch to another copy of the same page and go into the style sheet. What I'm going to do with the content style rule is to leave the existing background color and put a new definition for background color immediately after it. The reason for that is I want older browsers still to be able to see the background color. They won't be able to recognize RGBA or HSLA, but they'll recognize the background color property that uses the hexadecimal color. And open the color picker. Now the first thing I need to do is to click this little right arrow at the top right of the color picker, go to color format, and I'm going to choose RGBA, but if you prefer hue, saturation, lightness, feel free to use HSLA. RGBA, and then select white from the swatches here. Now when Dreamweaver inserts RGBA or HSLA, it automatically sets the alpha transparency to 1, which is the same as with opacity. 1 means that it's fully opaque, 0 is fully translucent. I'm going to change this to 0.8 and then switch over here and switch on live view, and you can see that what has happened is that the background to the text is translucent, but the image is not affected. So RGBA and HSLA affect only the background color. But you must remember to have two background colors, one using hexadecimal for older browsers, and the one that uses RGBA or HSLA must come after it, because it will then take precedence in the cascade in browsers that understand the new color formats. So just to recap, the opacity property affects all the children of an element that it's applied to. But using one of the new color formats, RGBA or HSLA, affects only the opacity of the background color. In both cases, the value is a decimal number between 0 and 1. 0 is fully transparent and 1 is fully opaque. One of web designers' biggest complaints over the years has been the lack of choice of fonts. Browsers use the fonts installed on the user's computer, restricting you to using common fonts such as Arial, Helvetica and Verdana. To use a more exotic or aesthetic font, up to now it's been necessary to embed them in images or use various image replacement techniques. Thankfully, the situation is changing, but it's not all plain sailing. The obstacles to a wider choice of fonts on the web have a complex background. In fact, web fonts have been supported by Internet Explorer since version 4 in 1997. But the problem was that Microsoft used a proprietary font format, so other browser vendors couldn't use it. They rely heavily on income from licensing, and they didn't want their fonts to be available free on the Internet where everybody could download them. Many fonts are now licensed for use in web pages. Instead of storing the fonts on your website, they're located on the hosting service's content distribution network. And also, there are many free web fonts now available. Although the situation has improved, a real problem is that there are multiple formats of web fonts. Internet Explorer uses embedded open type. This is a proprietary standard that other browser makers can't use. Firefox, Opera, Safari and Chrome support TrueType and OpenType. On the iPhone and iPad, they use Scalable Vector Graphics (SVG). Finally, there's the Web Open Font Format. This is a W3C standard and it's supported by Internet Explorer 9 and all other browsers except Safari, so if Safari comes on board, it looks as though it is the way to go in the future. But unfortunately at the moment, you need to support many different formats if your website is to be seen by people using different browsers. But don't despair. Help is at hand through useful websites such as Font Squirrel. Font Squirrel is perhaps the best-known source of web fonts that are free for commercial use. I've selected a font called Nobile on the Font Squirrel website. Each font has a different type of license, and it's important to know exactly how you can use it and where you can use it. The other very useful thing on Font Squirrel is they create what are called @font face kits. What a font face kit does is it gives you all the necessary formats and also a style sheet to go with them. So click that link and download the font face kit. I've already downloaded it and unzipped the files to a folder called Fonts. You can see that there are a lot of fonts in there, and at the bottom there is a style sheet. Let's just quickly open that. Inside the style sheet are several @font face rules. What this does is it declares a font family called Nobile Regular and then gives the source files for each type. This is the EOT type for Internet Explorer. This defines the source for Internet Explorer, for older versions of Internet Explorer, and the remaining definitions define the sources for Internet Explorer 9 and later, and for all the other web browsers that recognize fonts. So to embed fonts in a web page, you need to import the style sheet from the Font Squirrel Font Face Kit. So let's go into the style sheet for this page here, and I'm going to create an @import rule. Right-click, Code Hint Tools, and URL Browser. And I'll browse to my fonts folder, and I need to find that style sheet CSS. Click OK, close the parenthesis and a semicolon. Just save the style sheet, and you can now see in the Related Files toolbar that the style sheet has been imported. And what I need to do is to use that font family, Nobile Regular, in my own style sheet. So my font family at the moment says Lucida Sans Unicode, Lucida Grande, etc. So I just add, what was it again? Make sure we get the right one, Nobile Regular. Copy it and paste it, put in a little comma there, and save my style sheet. And if I go into Live View, you'll see that the font has now changed. Exit Live View. So toggle Live View on and off, and you can see the difference in the font. and it's as easy as that to embed fonts in a website. Using @FontFace can lift the look of your website, but it's important to remember that each web font that you use increases the size of the download for each visitor. This can significantly slow down your site, particularly for mobile users. Don't go wild and use them everywhere, but judicious use of web fonts can help make your site stand out from the Arial and Helvetica crowd. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to add a drop shadow to text without using any images. It's a very simple technique because you can use the CSS3 text shadow property. It was originally part of CSS2, but was dropped from the specification because browsers failed to support it. Ironically, once that happened, all browsers except Internet Explorer added support for text shadow, so it's now back part as CSS3. The simplest way to use text shadow in Dreamweaver is through the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel. You should also be in live view so that you can see the effect being applied dynamically as you make the adjustments. I'm going to just select the heading here and click Add Property and find text shadow in this list. There we are. And it's added a little icon in the value field. Click that to reveal a panel where you can set the values. Now, the values are X offset, which is the horizontal distance of the shadow, the Y offset, which is the vertical distance, and then you can also set a blur radius. Finally, there is color. This is the order that they appear within the property definition, but I'm going to use color first, because then I'll be able to see the effect as I change the X and Y offsets. Now, when you open the color picker, you need to make sure that the color format is set to either RGBA or HSLA so that you can have alpha transparency on the text shadow. Usually having a text shadow which is completely opaque is a little bit too heavy. I'm going to choose RGBA and then select black. Now I can start adjusting the X and Y offsets. Just going to make 1 pixel there. As you can see, it's added a dark black shadow on the right hand side. The offset of the shadow is 1 pixel to the right. If you use positive numbers, it moves to the right. Negative numbers moves the shadow to the left. And the Y offset, I'm going to set that at 1 pixel as well. So that's given me a vertical offset of 1 pixel. Positive numbers go down, negative numbers go up. And I'm going to add a blur radius of 1. Now that does look a little bit too heavy at the moment, but I'll just click away from the panel and expand here so that I can see all of the details. And there we've got RGBA 0001. That's black, fully opaque. So if I just change the alpha transparency from 1 to something which is very translucent, 0.3, and press enter, you'll see that that gives me a much more subtle shadow. Alpha transparency is expressed as a number between 0 and 1, 0 being completely transparent and 1 being completely opaque. And that's really all there is to it. You can add multiple shadows, multiple text shadows to fonts by creating a comma-separated list of values, but Dreamweaver doesn't support that within the CSS Styles panel. You would have to do that directly in the style sheet. Unless you want to create a special effect, I think it's best to go for a subtle text shadow, no more than 1 or 2 pixels, using translucent black or white, depending on the background. A major headache with CSS has been inconsistent implementation, leading to the need for hacks to serve different rules to certain browsers. The approach to CSS3 is completely different, as you'll see if you switch to the category view in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel. You access the Categories view by clicking the icon on the far left at the bottom of the Properties pane in the CSS Styles panel. At the bottom here you can see that there are 4 categories for Mozilla, Microsoft, Opera and WebKit. just open one of those. And the idea is that each browser uses its own prefix on new properties until the CSS3 specification has stabilized. So if you use a property that begins with -moz, it'll work only in Firefox and it won't affect any of the other browsers. So if Firefox implements the property incorrectly or differently from another browser, it won't impact on the way in which that property is seen in the other browser. Let's go a bit further down and open the Microsoft one. You can see that the number of vendor-specific properties for Microsoft is considerably smaller than for Mozilla, which is Firefox. So each browser is introducing its own properties at its own pace. If we go down and look at Opera, you'll see that Opera has actually very few. Now this isn't because Opera is being lazy or slow. In fact, Opera has been very quick to adopt CSS3, and it doesn't need many vendor-specific properties. To show you an example of vendor-specific properties in action, let's take a look at this page. I'll just turn on Live View, and the corners on this div have been changed so greatly that it's now become a circle. This has been done using the border radius property, which is new to CSS3. But when border radius was introduced by Firefox and by WebKit browsers, such as Safari and Chrome, there were doubts about exactly how the specification would be implemented. So Firefox introduced Moz border radius, and WebKit browsers, Safari and Chrome, used WebKit border radius. When you're using a CSS3 property that has got vendor-specific prefixes, you need to put the vendor-specific prefix versions first, followed by the official one. By placing the official property last, the CSS cascade ensures that it overrides the vendor-specific versions as soon as the specification stabilizes and the browser supports it. In some ways, this is a double-edged sword. It means you can implement new properties without waiting for all browsers to catch up, but it does make your style definitions more verbose. Instead of one line here, we've got 3. Also, you need to leave the vendor-specific versions in your style sheets for some time, even after a browser starts supporting the stabilized official property. You must remember, not everyone updates their browser as quickly as a web developer is likely to do. Another problem is knowing which properties require vendor-specific prefixes. Well, the CSS Styles panel helps you here in Category View by showing you the prefixes for the different browsers. Another way to find out is in Code View in your style sheet. If you type a hyphen, Dreamweaver code hints automatically bring up the vendor-specific prefixes. And if you select Moz, it then brings up those properties that are associated with the Moz vendor-specific prefix. If I type -ms, then I see the different set of properties which apply to Internet Explorer. Of course, these apply only to Internet Explorer 9 and beyond. Internet Explorer 8 does not support CSS3. In addition to Dreamweaver's code hints and the CSS Styles panel, a very useful resource is the caniuse.com website. If you go there and deselect all and then select CSS, it shows you which properties are supported by which versions of browsers. And there's a color code at the top here. Light green is supported, pink means that it's not supported, and sort of mid-green is partially supported. As you scroll down, you'll see that some properties have got these little yellow icons. And if it has a yellow icon, as the tooltip shows you, it requires this prefix to work. So for CSS3 box sizing, you need to use the Moz vendor-specific prefix in Firefox in every current version, whereas in Internet Explorer, it's fully supported without a vendor-specific prefix. The border radius, which I demonstrated before, is supported by new versions of Firefox and Safari and Chrome, but the older versions still need the vendor-specific prefix. Using vendor-specific prefixes results in more work. Your style sheets are longer, and you need to check browser compatibility. But I think it's certainly a price worth paying because it means an end to having to resort to hacks to deal with differences between browsers. Creating backgrounds with rounded corners has always involved images and complex structures of nested divs. Not anymore, thanks to the CSS3 box radius property. Even this circular background is created with CSS, as you'll see when I disable a couple of style rules in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel. As you can see, it's just an ordinary div which is square in shape. So let me show you how to apply the border radius property in Dreamweaver CS5.5. Let's go to the original copy of the page. And you need to be in live view because Dreamweaver applies border radius dynamically. So if you're in live view, you can actually see and visually adjust the amount of roundness on the corners. Let's first do it with this column of text. Select the div that it's in the tag selector at the bottom of the document window. So that has given us in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel the rules for the content style rule. So add property, and it's border radius that we want to apply. When you select it, Dreamweaver puts a little icon in the value field. Click that icon, and you can set the corner radius to be the same for all. And if you set the same for all, you just need to change the value of top left. So as I begin to change the value, you should be able to see that the corner up here is beginning to change. And the more that I increase it, now at 15 pixels, you can see that there's a rather nice rounded corner there. If you want to apply different amounts of roundness to the corners, deselect this checkbox and then change the values in top left, top right, and bottom left. I'm not going to do that for the moment. I'll just reselect it so we've got the same amount of roundness on each corner. The border radius property is fully supported by the most recent versions of all mainstream browsers, but it was originally introduced in Firefox and Safari on an experimental basis, so you need to add the Moz and WebKit vendor-specific prefixes to the style definition. Now the quick way to do that is to right-click the property, the border radius property in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel, and select Go to Code from the context menu, and that takes you directly to the border radius definition within the style rule that you've been working on. And I'm just going to select that, copy it to my clipboard by pressing Ctrl-C on Windows or Command-C on a Mac, put in a new line and paste it twice. Then on the first one I'll put -moz, and on the second one -webkit. So now we've got three properties there, two with vendor-specific prefixes, one for older versions of Firefox and the other one for older versions of Safari. And at the bottom is the official property, border radius. Because the official property comes last, that takes precedence. So if somebody views this page in a new version of Firefox, so it will ignore the one with the vendor-specific prefix and apply the correct one, border radius. But in older versions of Firefox that don't recognize the standard property, they'll apply the vendor-specific version. So how do you create a circle? Well, let's select this particular div in live view. It's the reminder div. And you can see in the Properties pane here that the height is 130 pixels and the width is 130 pixels. In other words, it's a square. So if I apply a border radius that's half that amount, in other words 65 pixels, I'll create a circle. So let's just do that quickly. Border radius. Click that little icon. I want the corner radius to be the same for all, and I'm going to put 65 in there. And as you see, a perfect circle. And that's all there is to it. Of course, you need to add the vendor-specific prefixes to border radius again, so go to Code and add the vendor-specific prefixes for Moz, which is Firefox, and WebKit for the older versions of Safari. So there you are. Adding rounded corners to backgrounds with the border radius property is quick and easy in Dreamweaver CS5.5. The property is supported in the latest versions of all browsers, but not in Internet Explorer 6 through 8. Older browsers simply ignore the border radius property, leaving straight corners. It's not as attractive, but it's certainly not a disaster either. Even in live view, the images in this page seem rather flat. To make them stand out better, they could do with a subtle drop shadow and maybe a faint border. Nothing too heavy, but just enough to lift them from the page. In the past, adding a drop shadow involved editing the image itself in a graphics program, or adding an offset background image of a shadow. That's no longer necessary thanks to the CSS3 box shadow property. I'm going to click on this image in live view, and that brings up in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel the properties for the Float Left class, which floats images to the left-hand side of the current element. I'm going to apply the box shadow to this particular class, and then that will apply it to the image which is inside the class. Unfortunately, Live View doesn't yet support the standard box shadow property, so you need to switch to the Category view in the Properties pane of the CSS Styles panel. Categories view is accessed by clicking the far left icon at the bottom left of the CSS Styles panel. And we need to go down to find the WebKit vendor-specific properties and find WebKit box shadow. There's a little icon there which I click to open a panel which lets me set the properties for the box shadow. Now, there are quite a few properties that you can set for box shadow. You can have an inset shadow. The X offset controls the horizontal position of the shadow. Positive values move it to the right, negative values move it to the left. The Y offset, that controls the vertical offset of the shadow. Positive values move it down, negative values move it up. You can also set a blur radius, that can only be a positive value, and spread radius spreads the shadow beyond the basic bounds of the original element. And the last one is colour. Now, even though it's last, it's the one that I'm going to select first, and the reason for that is because I want to be able to see the effect of the drop shadow as I make the adjustments to the X and Y offsets. So click the colour box here. The first thing that you need to do is to make sure that the colour format is either RGBA or HSLA. That gives you alpha transparency, and for a drop shadow you should normally have some transparency in the colour, otherwise it tends to look a little bit too heavy. I'm going to use RGBA and select black, and then start adjusting the X and Y offsets. Now, as I increase the X offset, you can see a black line is appearing on the right-hand side of the image. The reason for this is that when you select RGBA or HSLA as the colour format in Dreamweaver, it automatically sets the opacity to be completely opaque. You have to change the opacity afterwards. So this is just giving me the idea of the extent of the shadow. Let's do the Y offset. I think we'll go for 3 pixels there, and maybe the blur radius we'll put that at 5 pixels. Normally for a drop shadow I don't think that you need to set the spread radius. I'll show you later in this video what the spread radius does. So just click away from that, and I need to just expand this a little bit more. And now adjust the amount of opacity in my colour. Change the last value to 0.3. Press enter, and you can see we've now got quite a nice subtle drop shadow on that image, and because it's applied to the class, it's applied automatically to this image too. Because I've used WebKit box shadow, I need to go to the code and add the vendor-specific prefix for Firefox, which is Moz, and also the standard property. So right-click, go to code, and then I can copy and paste this property. I need 2 copies. Change the first one to Moz and the last one to the standard property. This ensures that the drop shadow will be applied in all browsers that support drop shadows. As I mentioned earlier, you can create inset shadows and set the shadows spread. Unfortunately, Live View in the Windows version of Dreamweaver CS5.5 doesn't render inset shadows correctly, so I'll show you the effect in Google Chrome instead. I've created 6 examples here. In the first one, the horizontal and vertical offsets are positive, so the shadow is to the right and down. In this one, the offsets are negative, so the shadow goes up and to the left. With an inset shadow, if it's positive, it's placed on the top and the left-hand side. That's because it's moving down and to the right. And the negative values for the inset one, the shadow is put on the bottom and on the right-hand side. With spread, if the spread is smaller than the horizontal and vertical offsets, it's actually hidden behind the box in the opposite direction. If it's greater, you see the spread in all directions, but it is actually pushed in the same direction as the offsets. So if you want it to be the same all round, you shouldn't have any offsets. So there you are. Using CSS to add drop shadows to images and other page elements is quick and easy with box shadow. Remember to use the WebKit vendor-specific prefix when applying box shadow in Live View. Then apply the Moz vendor-specific prefix and finish the style rule with the standard property to ensure that the effect is displayed correctly in all browsers that support drop shadows. If I turn on Live View, you can see that this page has already been enhanced with CSS3 features, including the rounded corners and translucent background on this column of text. This originally square div has also been turned into a circle by setting its border radius to half its width and height. But I'd like to rotate this div to make it look more like a sticker. So I'll just click there and then select Div Reminder in the tag selector at the bottom of the document window, and that brings up the style rules for the reminder div here in the Properties pane. But Live View doesn't yet support the standard transform property, so switch to Category View in the Properties pane by clicking the icon at the far left of the bottom of the panel, and then we need to find the WebKit category, which is down at the bottom here. Expand that and find WebKit Transform. If I click in the value field and then open the little menu, you'll see that Transform has got quite a few possible values, but the one I'm interested in is Rotate. And you need to put the value for Rotate between the parentheses. The Rotate function takes a value in degrees, and the CSS unit of measurement is DEG. And as with all CSS units of measurement, there's no space between the number and the unit. I'm going to make it 20 degrees, 20 DEG. And then just refresh Live View, and bingo, there we've got a nicely rotated div. Now, because I've used the WebKit vendor-specific prefix, I need to adjust my style rules so that I've got vendor-specific prefixes for other browsers and the standard property. So let's open the style sheet and go to the reminder rule. There we are, we've got WebKit Transform Rotate 20 degrees. Unfortunately, you need to add the vendor-specific prefixes for all browsers. So you need to have 5 copies. So just copy it and paste it. So we'll have the first one as Moz, Then we need one for Internet Explorer, MS, and one for Opera, which is just a simple O, WebKit transform, and then lastly the standard transform property. And now that will work in all browsers that support the transform property. It's a pity that you need to use the vendor-specific prefixes for all the browsers, but apart from that, rotating elements with the transform property couldn't be much easier. In this video I'm going to show you how to use the CSS3 transform and transform origin properties to scale these images to their full size when you hover over them like this. I've set up this page in Dreamweaver with 3 images which are inside a div. The original width of each image is 400 pixels, but if I select one of the images, you can see in the property inspector that I've removed the width and the height, because when they scale, I want them to maintain their aspect ratio. Let's take a look at the CSS styles that I've already set up for the images. The images are all slightly different heights. So what I've done is I've set them to display as inline block and vertical align middle, so they align horizontally along their center line. To scale the images when they're hovered over, I need to create a style rule that uses the hover pseudo class. So let's create one images, img, and the hover pseudo class. The property that scales images, or any other elements, is the transform property. So transform, and you can see that transform has got a lot of possible values. The one that I'm interested in is scale. You can see that what Dreamweaver has done has put in a pair of parentheses with a comma in between. The scale function can take 2 values, the first one being for the horizontal scale and the second one being for the vertical scale. If you want them to scale the same amount in both directions, then you remove the comma and just put in 1 value. Now, unfortunately, the transform property isn't yet fully supported by all browsers, so what you need to do is to add the vendor-specific prefixes for every browser. That's for Firefox, Internet Explorer, Opera, and the WebKit browsers. So I need to copy that and paste it 4 times. And then add the vendor-specific prefixes. So I'll add moz, then ms for Internet Explorer, O for Opera, and WebKit. So if I just save that now, and switch to the design view and turn on live view, it's not working. Let's see why. Let's take a look at the styles again. I see the problem. I've got the wrong name for the div. It should be images. Let's save that again. And then go back into live view. And now you can see that the images are scaling. But there's a problem that I've got. This image on the left is scaling so much that it's going off the left of the screen. What I need to do is to control the point from which the scaling begins, the point from which the transformation begins. And to do that, you need to use the transform origin property. So let's go out of live view and back into the style sheet. Now, my first image is called Sushi JPG. So what I can do is I can create a selector that uses an attribute selector that looks at the last part of an attribute's value. So what I want to do is create a rule for img open square brackets src, then $ equals sushi.jpg. And I need to add the transform origin. The transform origin property can take two values. The first value is the horizontal position of the origin, and the second one is the vertical one. If you have just one value, then the other one is assumed to be center. What I want to do is to transform. I want to scale this image from the center of the left-hand side, so I'll just use left. And again, I need to add the vendor-specific prefixes. So I need 4 copies of that. And add in the vendor-specific prefixes. -mos, -ms, -o, and -webkit. And if we save that, and then go into live view, again, it's not working, so let's see what the problem with the style rule is. Ah, yes. There is a period, the dot, in the middle of the name. So normally you don't need to have the values in quotes, but because there's a period in the middle there, I need to wrap that value in quotes. And if I save it again, go back into live view, you see it is now transforming from the left-hand side. The middle one transforms from the center, which is exactly what we want, but this one, well, it still fits within the window, but it would be much nicer if we do it from the right. So we'll do that again. Let's just check the name. This one is called Stone-Lantern JPG. I think Lantern JPG is enough for me. And to save time, I'm just going to copy that rule and paste it. Change that to Lantern JPG, and then instead of left, I need these to be right. Just save that. Go back into live view. And yes, it's now transforming from the center point on the right. So that's how you scale elements and control the point from which the transformation begins and to which it returns. The transformation is instant, but many browsers also support the transition property, which smooths the animation over a specified duration. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use CSS transitions to improve the way certain styles respond to user interaction. When you hover over a link or any other element, any styles defined by the hover pseudo class are applied instantly. Using transitions allows you to animate the change from one state to the other in a smooth manner. This is particularly useful in combination with the transform property. For example, if you scale an image using transform on its own, the image jumps instantly from one size to the other. By adding a transition, you can zoom the image smoothly in and out. You define a transition using the following properties. Transition property determines which other CSS properties are affected by the transition. Transition duration sets the duration of the transition from one state to the other. Normally it's set in seconds. Transition timing function takes a keyword that describes how the transition progresses. I'll explain the keywords in a moment. Transition delay allows you to set a delay before the transition begins. And transition shorthand just combines all these properties together. The transition timing function takes one of these keywords. Ease means that the transition starts slow, speeds up, and then slows down again at the end. Linear means the transition should be even throughout. Ease in starts slow, speeds up, and maintains the same pace to the end. Ease out maintains a steady pace from the start, but slows down at the end. Ease in out is similar to ease, but the slower pace at the start and end is more pronounced. Cubic Bezier takes 4 comma-separated numbers specifying the points of the Bezier curve used to calculate the easing. Unless you're a mathematic whiz kid who knows how to specify the points of a Bezier curve, you'll probably never use this final option. Right, let's put CSS transitions into action. In this page I've applied the transform property to scale the images when they're hovered over. So if we just look at it in live view, you see that what happens is when I hover over that image, it immediately jumps from one size to the other. And the same happens when I move my mouse away. Jump, jump. So the transition will make it a smooth zoom in and zoom out. Go back into the style sheet. Now the transform property has been defined in the hover pseudo class. You might expect that that's where you would put the transition as well. But the normal practice is to put the transition in the rule that affects the normal state of the element. So I'm going to define the transition up here in this rule, which controls the images inside the images div. I'm going to use the transition shorthand. I want the transition to last half a second, so it'll be 0.5 s. S is the unit of measurement for seconds in CSS. And like all units of measurement, there should be no gap between the number and the unit itself. And from the code hints, I'm going to pick ease in out as the transition timing function. And that's all I really need to do. I don't particularly want to delay the transition, and I want it to apply to all the elements within the style rule. And that's the default way in which transitions work. You only need to specify the property if it's only one property that you want to change. CSS transitions are very new, so you need to use vendor-specific prefixes for the transition property, and you need to use it for all of the browsers. So that means I need to copy this transition rule and paste it 4 times. Then I'll make the first one -moz for Firefox. Then -ms for Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer doesn't support transitions until Internet Explorer 10. For Opera, it's O. And for Safari and Chrome, we need -WebKit. So let's just save that. Expand the page and toggle live view on and off, and let's see what the results are. In live view, it isn't a very smooth transition, but you can see that the images are expanding and contracting over time rather than instantaneously. Let's just test that in a real browser to see what it looks like. So here it is in Firefox 4, and you can see the transition is now very smooth indeed. And let's just make one more check. This is in Safari, and again, a very smooth transition. So it's actually very simple to create smooth transitions, smooth animations using CSS transitions. Using CSS transitions allows you to achieve effects that were previously possible only with JavaScript or Flash, and used in moderation they can greatly enhance web pages, but I wouldn't go overboard and use them purely for the sake of doing so.